Have you ever had someone with just a little bit of power decide to make your life as difficult as possible? Not because you broke any rules. Not because you caused any problems. Just because they looked at you and decided you seemed like someone who wouldn't fight back. That's what happened to me. And before this story's over, I want you to understand something. The wheelchair ramp on my front porch was never the real issue. It was never about community standards. It was never about property values. It was about one person who wanted to prove she was in charge and made the mistake of picking the wrong target to prove it on. My name isn't important. What I did before retirement is going to come up later, and I'd rather let that land when it lands. What you need to know right now is that I'm a veteran. After years of service, multiple surgeries, and a long road learning how to live in a body that doesn't cooperate the way it used to, I moved into my neighborhood looking for one thing: peace, a front porch, morning coffee, neighbors I could wave to, a life that was quiet and mine. The wheelchair ramp attached to that front porch wasn't a renovation project. It wasn't cosmetic. It was the difference between independence and being trapped inside my own home, between leaving when I wanted to and having to wait for someone else to help me. I had installed it properly, permitted, inspected, done right. For 8 months, nobody said a single word about it. Then a new HOA president got elected. The first few weeks, I noticed small things. A neighbor received a written warning because his trash bin was visible from the street for a couple of extra hours. Another was told her flower pots weren't an approved color. People laughed about it, called her overzealous, figured she'd settle down once she got comfortable in the role. She didn't settle down. She turned her attention toward me. I opened my mailbox one afternoon and pulled out an official HOA notice, printed on letterhead, signed at the bottom.
This ramp is illegal. It has to come down.
We must maintain our community standards.
I don't understand why they are doing this to me.
My wheelchair ramp was listed as an unauthorized exterior modification. I read that sentence 3 times standing at the mailbox. Then I went inside and called the HOA office, completely certain it was a clerical error, a mix-up, something that would be fixed in 5 minutes with a quick conversation. It was not a mix-up. The woman who answered told me the president had personally reviewed my property and made the determination herself. I explained as calmly as I could that the ramp was medically necessary, that I needed it to safely enter and exit my own home, that removing it wasn't a reasonable option. It was asking me to give up my independence. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she said, in a voice that sounded genuinely uncomfortable, the president said that exceptions create problems. I stayed quiet for a moment. Exceptions? I wasn't asking for a favor. I wasn't asking to be let off the hook for something I'd done wrong. I was asking for access to my own front door, the front door of a home I owned, a modification I had properly permitted and installed. And I was being told that allowing that was a problem. Over the next several days, I sent them everything: medical documentation, the original permit, inspection records, installation specifications, anything and everything that could possibly be relevant. Every response came back the same word: denied. Then the fine started, one after another, arriving with the same tone, the same wording, the same absolute confidence that eventually I would just give up and make it stop. The first fine annoyed me. The second made me angry. By the third, I'll be honest with you, I was tired. There was a moment, maybe 10 minutes long, where I genuinely considered just paying them, not because they were right, not because I agreed with any of it, but because fighting takes energy, and some days the energy isn't there. But every time I looked at that ramp, I thought about what it represented: the ability to leave my own house without asking someone for help. And I kept pushing back. That's when I found out something that reframed this entire situation. I was talking to a neighbor, someone who'd lived in the neighborhood for years, and in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation, he mentioned something almost in passing. There were 3 other wheelchair ramps in the neighborhood. 3. Not one of them had received a violation notice. Not one had been fined. Not one had been threatened with removal. I went completely still. Why me? The more I sat with that question, the less it felt like a rules issue. It felt deliberate. So I started asking around. Quietly, just listening. And what I kept hearing from multiple neighbors who had no reason to coordinate their stories was that this HOA president had spent her first months in office trying to establish that she was tougher than whoever came before her. She wanted deference. She wanted people to feel her authority. And apparently, the one thing she couldn't stand was being pushed back on. Something clicked into place. She wasn't targeting my ramp. She was targeting me. Because I hadn't quietly accepted the first notice and disappeared. And she had no idea who she was actually dealing with. Then came the community meeting. She stood at the front of the room, composed and certain, and gave a speech about enforcement standards and neighborhood consistency. Without using my name, she looked toward my side of the room and said, "Rules are rules. If we start making exceptions for one homeowner, where exactly does that stop?" The room went very quiet. I felt eyes turn in my direction. Some neighbors looked uncomfortable. A few looked genuinely angry and not at me. One woman across the room caught my eye and gave me a small, tight nod that said, "I see what's happening here." But the president just stood there, completely at ease, acting as though a wheelchair ramp was somehow a threat to the fabric of the neighborhood. That was the moment I stopped trying to reason with her, because I realized something I probably should have understood earlier. She wasn't confused about what my ramp was. She wasn't genuinely concerned about standards. She was performing authority, and the performance only works if the other person shrinks. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that before retirement, I had spent decades in a role that required me to understand exactly how people who abuse small amounts of authority tend to operate. They're almost always protecting something. 3 days after that meeting, a neighbor knocked on my door. He was holding a manila folder. "I think you need to see this," he said. Inside were photocopies of HOA records going back several years. I started reading the first page, and within 60 seconds, I understood that this was no longer just a story about a wheelchair ramp. I set the folder on my kitchen table and went through it slowly, page by page. What I was looking at were internal HOA violation records, the kind the board maintains to track complaints, enforcement actions, and outcomes. The violations themselves weren't surprising. Every neighborhood accumulates them. Unapproved paint colors, oversized sheds, fences installed without sign-off, landscaping changes that didn't go through the review process. What was surprising was a pattern of what happened to them afterward. Some violations had full documentation: complaint, notice, fine, resolution, the kind of clean paper tray that a board is supposed to maintain. Others just stopped, complaint filed, initial record created, then nothing, no follow-up notice, no fine, no resolution note. The file just ended mid-process, as though someone had simply decided it didn't need to go any further. I started marking the ones that stopped. Then I looked at which properties they belonged to. Some I didn't recognize, but several were properties I knew. Homes belonging to people I'd seen at board meetings. People who seemed comfortable there. People who didn't look like they were holding their breath the way some of the other residents did. And then I turned a page and saw a name I recognized immediately. The HOA president herself. Her property had 2 open violation records, an unapproved fence modification along her side yard, and an exterior paint change on her garage door that didn't match the approved color palette. The same palette she had cited when issuing notices to 2 other residents on her street. Both records had been initiated. Neither had gone anywhere. I put the folder down and looked at the neighbor who'd brought it. "Where did you get this?" I asked. His cousin had been on the previous board. He explained. When leadership changed, certain records were passed along informally. Things that hadn't been properly closed out, that the incoming board was supposed to review and address. They never had been. Nobody wants to get involved, he said. People know things aren't right. But the moment it comes to actually confronting the HOA, they back down. They don't want to become the next target. I understood that completely. Most people just want to live their lives. They're not looking for a fight with their own neighborhood board. The threat of fines, of public meetings, of being made an example, it keeps people quiet. That's exactly what she was counting on. After he left, I spent about 2 hours going through everything again more carefully, and the picture that emerged was consistent. Residents who had complained about the president's enforcement practices in the past. Their violation files were the ones that escalated fastest and hardest. Residents who seemed to have relationships with board members. Their files were the ones that quietly closed. This wasn't random administrative inconsistency. This was deliberate. But I still had a problem. Having records that showed hypocrisy was one thing. Proving that the hypocrisy was intentional, that it was a pattern rather than a series of individual oversights, was something else entirely. If I walked into a board meeting with this folder, she would explain it away. Administrative backlog, previous leadership's failures, records that were already under review. She would have an answer for everything, and she would give those answers with the same composed confidence she used for everything else. I needed more than what was in the folder. The next morning, I opened my mailbox. Another fine notice. Same wording, same amount, same tone that said, "We're not going anywhere, and eventually you'll stop." I brought it inside and set it on top of the folder. Then I picked up the phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in a while, a former colleague, retired now, someone who had spent years working in local government and understood how administrative records were supposed to work and what it looked like when they didn't. I didn't explain the full situation. I just described what I was seeing. Internal records showing enforcement actions that had been initiated and then abandoned with no documentation of why they were closed. His response was measured, and it told me exactly what I needed to hear. "What you're describing might not just be internal inconsistency," he said. "If these modifications required county permits, and those permits were never filed, then the discrepancy isn't just inside the HOA. It's between the HOA's records and the county's. And that's a different category of problem entirely." I hadn't thought about the county records, but he was right. In most jurisdictions, exterior structural modifications, fences, ramps, certain landscaping changes, require permits filed with the county, not just internal HOA approval. The two systems are supposed to align. If they didn't, if modifications were appearing in HOA records as approved but weren't showing up in county filings, that was something no board president could explain away as administrative backlog. That was something verifiable independently by anyone who looked. The next morning, I submitted my first public records request to the county. The county records came back faster than I expected. I had requested permit filings associated with the specific property addresses I'd pulled from the HOA folder. 3 properties where the internal HOA records showed approved modifications, including hers. I laid the county documents next to the HOA records and went through them one by one. The first property, a pergola installation. HOA records showed board approval. Signed off, dated. County records showed a permit filed, inspected, closed. They matched. Clean. The second property, a fence extension along the rear property line. HOA records showed approval. County records showed nothing. No permit filed for that address during that period. Not denied. Not pending. Simply absent. I made a note and moved on. The third property, her fence modification. The one with the open violation record that had never been followed up on. HOA records showed the violation had been filed. And then, several months later, a separate document appeared in the same file marked Resolved, Modification Approved Retroactively. I had to read that twice. Retroactively approved. She had filed a violation against her own fence, presumably because a neighbor had complained. And then, using her authority as president, had simply approved it herself after the fact. County records for that property during that same window, no permit, no filing, no record of the modification existing at all as far as the county was concerned. So on paper, inside the HOA system, this modification was now approved, but it had never been properly permitted. And the person who approved it retroactively, without going to the county process, was the same person who was fining me for a permitted, inspected, properly filed wheelchair ramp. I sat with that for a long time. I'm not an attorney. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't making legal conclusions. But I understood enough about how these systems work to know that what I was looking at was not a paperwork technicality. This was an HOA president who had used her position to approve her own non-compliant modification, without following the process those approvals required, while simultaneously finding a disabled veteran for a modification that followed every step of that process correctly. The contradiction was not subtle. I organized everything into a clear comparison. HOA records on one side, county records on the other, discrepancies highlighted, dates noted. Then I sent it back to my former colleague. His response this time was longer. He said what I had was potentially significant, but that documentation alone rarely changes anything in community governance situations. What matters, he said, is whether other residents are willing to confirm what they've observed, whether there are people inside the neighborhood who have been affected by this pattern and are willing to say so. Paper tells you what happened, he said. People tell you whether anyone cared enough to notice. I needed to find the people who had noticed. I didn't go door to door. I didn't write letters or send emails. I didn't call a neighborhood meeting or post anything publicly. I just started having the kind of conversations that happen naturally when neighbors see each other outside. And what I found over about 2 weeks of those conversations was that I was not alone, not even slightly. The woman 2 doors down had received a violation notice 18 months ago for her window shutter color. She'd repainted and paid for it herself. No argument, and moved on. But she mentioned almost incidentally that the president's own house, on a different street, had shutters in a nearly identical shade. She had noticed, never said anything, figured it wasn't worth the trouble. The family at the end of the block had submitted a formal request to install a small garden border near their driveway. Denied. The denial letter cited the aesthetic consistency guidelines. About 6 weeks later, a similar border appeared outside a property 2 streets over, owned by someone who attended board meetings regularly and sat near the president at all of them. That one had been approved. No committee review. Approved the same week it went in. The family had also noticed. They hadn't said anything either. But the person whose information changed everything was a retired teacher who lived 3 streets over. She had attended every single board meeting for the past year. Not because she had a complaint pending. Not because she was involved in any dispute. She just thought people should pay attention to how their community was being run. She had kept handwritten notes from every meeting. When I asked if I could see them, she didn't hesitate. She brought them out in a binder, organized by date, and sat across from me while I read through them. Her notes documented things that, individually, could be explained away. Agenda items tabled without discussion. Resident complaints acknowledged and then never mentioned again. Votes taken in rapid succession, without the review periods the bylaws required. But there was one entry she had circled herself about 8 months back. A vote to expand the president's individual enforcement authority, giving her the ability to issue certain violation notices and approvals without full board review. It had passed 3-2. I asked her if she knew who the 2 dissenting votes were. She did. Both of them were still on the board. I found them separately on different days. I showed each of them what I had: the violation records, the county filing comparisons, the retroactive approval on her property. I didn't editorialize. I just laid it out and asked if any of it was consistent with what they'd observed from inside the board. The first one listened carefully, asked a few questions, and then said, "We flagged the enforcement authority expansion at the time. We said it created a conflict of interest. We were told our concerns were noted. Were they addressed?" I asked. "No," he said. The second board member said something simpler. "I'm not surprised by any of this. I've been waiting for someone to put it together." Both of them agreed to provide written statements. I went home that evening and looked at everything I had assembled. Documented violation records showing selective enforcement over 18 months. County filings that didn't match HOA internal approvals for specific properties. A retroactive self-approval by the president for her own non-compliant modification. Independent accounts from multiple neighbors, gathered separately, describing the same patterns. Written statements from 2 sitting board members confirming that internal concerns had been raised and ignored. A year's worth of meeting notes from a resident who had simply been paying attention. I'm not someone who acts impulsively. I spent a long career learning that the moment you move matters as much as what you do when you move. This was the moment. Most people don't know that HOAs operate under a layer of external oversight. Every HOA functions under its own governing documents, bylaws, rules, covenants. But in most states, those documents and the way the board enforces them fall under the jurisdiction of a state real estate or community association regulatory body, a place where formal complaints can be filed, a place where an investigation isn't controlled by the person being investigated. Most residents never think about that layer. Most HOA presidents are quietly relieved that they don't. I filed a formal complaint, not an email, not a letter expressing concern, a structured, documented complaint with a clear evidentiary basis, the violation records, the county filing comparisons, the pattern of selective enforcement, the retroactive self-approval, the written statements from 2 board members, and my own complete history. Every fine notice I had received for a wheelchair ramp that 3 similar ramps in the same neighborhood had never been cited for. I also filed a separate complaint under the Fair Housing Act, because this wasn't just an HOA governance issue, denying a medically necessary accessibility modification, while simultaneously approving similar structural changes for other residents, and using retroactive self-approval to protect non-compliant modifications on the president's own property, is a federal issue. The Fair Housing Act protects people with disabilities from exactly this kind of discriminatory application of housing rules. She had handed me that argument herself, by approving things for other people that she denied for me. I filed both complaints on the same day and told no one. I went to the next board meeting and sat in the 3rd row. She ran it the same way she always did, unhurried, confident, not a flicker of concern. She had built her entire approach on the assumption that residents would absorb the pressure, go quiet, and let things continue. She had not considered the possibility that someone had gone around her completely. 3 weeks later, the HOA received a formal notice of investigation. I know this because both board members who had provided written statements called me within the same hour it arrived. They said the closed session that followed was the first time either of them had seen her lose her composure. She had demanded to know who had filed. She had insisted the complaints were retaliatory. She had argued that the documentation was being taken out of context. The board members told her the regulatory body would determine that. The investigation covered 3 areas: selective enforcement practices, the discrepancy between internal HOA records and county permit filings, and the specific handling of my wheelchair ramp violation as it related to fair housing protections. It ran for 11 weeks. I didn't contact the investigators. I had submitted what I had clearly and completely, and I let the process work. That's the part people always underestimate about situations like this. You do your part. You document everything. You find the right place to take it. And then you trust the process to move at the speed it moves. Patience is not passivity. The findings arrived in writing on a Tuesday morning. I read the document at my kitchen table, in the same chair where I had spread out those HOA records for the first time. I'm going to give you the substance of what it said, without reading it word for word. The regulatory body found that the HOA had engaged in a documented pattern of inconsistent enforcement that was not aligned with its own stated bylaws. Specific enforcement decisions had favored certain residents over others without procedural justification. The retroactive approval of the president's own property modification, without proper county permitting, was flagged as an improper use of board authority. On the fair housing complaint, the violation notices issued against my wheelchair ramp were found to lack legal basis under Fair Housing Act protections. The ramp was a reasonable accommodation for a disability. Denying it, while approving structural modifications for other residents through a process that didn't apply to me, constituted discriminatory enforcement. All fines associated with my wheelchair ramp were ordered rescinded, immediately and in full. 3 modifications that had been approved informally during the current president's tenure, including the fence on our own property, were flagged for mandatory review and required proper county permitting within 60 days. The president received a formal censure from the regulatory body. She did not seek re-election. At the next annual meeting, held about 6 weeks later, the neighborhood looked different from the inside. The 2 board members who had provided written statements were elected to expanded roles with broader oversight authority. The retired teacher who had kept notes for a year, who had simply been paying attention when no one else was elected to the board for the first time. She ran unopposed. I was in the third row again. Nobody pointed toward my side of the room. Nobody gave any speeches about exceptions. The first item of old business the new acting president addressed was a motion to rescind all outstanding fines related to accessibility modifications across the entire neighborhood. Not just mine. Every accessibility modification that had been cited, fined, or threatened during the previous administration. The motion covered all of them. It passed unanimously. I drove home that evening and sat on my porch for a long time. The ramp was still there, exactly where it had always been, exactly where it belonged. She had looked at a disabled veteran and made a calculation. She had decided that someone who needed help getting in and out of his own house probably wouldn't have the energy or the knowledge to fight back effectively. She had assumed that if she applied enough pressure, consistently enough, I would eventually do the math and decide it wasn't worth it. She didn't know she was applying that pressure to someone who had once coordinated operations in active war zones. Someone who had spent decades learning that the people who underestimate you are always the easiest ones to hold accountable. She was wrong about almost everything. But here's the part one keeps coming back to. This story isn't really about me. I had resources she didn't account for. I had a background she didn't know about. I was a senior Army general who has dealt with hostile enemies at warfront. I had a former colleague who understood public records, neighbors who were willing to speak once someone gave them a reason to, and enough patience to let the process work. Most people don't have all of that. Most people, when an HOA comes after them unfairly, absorb the fines and move on, not because they deserve to lose, because the path forward isn't obvious and the cost of fighting feels too high. What I hope this story does, if it does anything at all, is make that path a little more visible. Document everything, from the first notice forward. Check your HOA's internal records against county public records. Find the neighbors who have noticed things and haven't said anything yet, and know that in most states, there's a regulatory body that exists precisely for situations like this, a place to take documented evidence that operates outside the control of the person you're filing against. She thought she was dealing with someone who needed a ramp. She was dealing with someone who also knew how to use it to walk right out the front door and take this exactly where it needed to go. Some things are worth the fight. And sometimes when you fight the right way, the outcome is bigger than what you were fighting for in the first place.